Renounce God, Be God, a comprehensive study guide. This study guide explores the spiritual teachings of Sri Bhagavath as presented in Renounce God, Be God. The text outlines a path to enlightenment based on a simple understanding of the mind's functions rather than strenuous yogic practices. It challenges traditional spiritual expectations, emphasizing that liberation is a natural flowing state that occurs when the mind stops struggling against itself. Part I. Short answer quiz instructions. Answer the following questions in 2 to 3 sentences based on the provided text. 1. According to the author, what is the fundamental ignorance that humans suffer from? 2. How does the text define the Atman in relation to the physical body and the mind? 3. Explain the analogy of the tongue used to describe the nature of self-realization. 4. What is the difference between absolute truth and practical truth regarding the Atman? 5. Describe the 4 states of the mind as classified in the spiritual scriptures. 6. What does the term Chithabasan or Abasan refer to? And contrast the concepts of Manolaya and Manonasa. 8. Why does the author argue that spiritual effort or searching is often an obstacle to liberation? 9. Explain the metaphor of the heat of gold versus the heat of iron regarding anger. 10. In the practical world, why is renunciation considered the worst approach? Part 2. Answer Key 1. Ignorance is the misconception that an individual is merely the physical body and the psychological mind. It occurs when the mind, the reflected consciousness, adopts physical experiences as its own and considers itself a limited, bounded human being rather than the eternal Atman. 2. Atman is described as the real nature of a human being, which is beyond birth, death, and the fluctuations of the mind, while the body and mind are considered inanimate materials that function through reflected light. The Atman is the self-luminous source and the real subject or real seer. San. The tongue analogy explains that just as the tongue is the tasteless substratum required to perceive all 6 tastes, the Atman is the tasteless or sensation-free sensitivity that allows all experiences to occur. Seeking a blissful enlightenment is a mistake, as the natural state of the Atman is as ordinary and neutral as the beingness of the tongue. 4. Absolute truth is the scriptural fact that we are the Brahman or Atman, but this cannot be lived out directly in daily activities. Practical truth recognizes the mind and body as the steps of the stair we must use, while the absolute truth acts as the parapet wall or railing that provides safety and reference. 5. The 4 states are sleep unconscious, dream semi-conscious imagination, waking the conscious participants in reality, and Durya, the highest awakening. In the Durya state, the waking state is recognized as a dream, and one realizes the Atman as the substratum of all existence. And 6. Chithabasan refers to the reflected light of consciousness in the mind. Just as the moon reflects the sun, the mind reflects the total light of Brahman, becoming a limited consciousness that contains both individual intelligence and ignorance. 7. Manolaya is the fixing or stagnation of the mind on a particular feeling or thought, which creates psychological experiences like joy or sorrow. Manonasa is the liquidation or ending of this fixing, allowing the mind to return to its natural, liquid, and flowing state. 8. Searching is an obstacle because it is an act of the mind, Manolaya, that assumes there is something to attain in the future. Since the Atman is always present here and now, the very act of seeking creates a dualistic struggle that prevents the mind from settling into its natural, effortless state. 9. The heat of gold represents the anger of an enlightened person, which fades immediately like gold dipped in water. The heat of iron represents the anger of the ignorant, which persists because the individual fights with the feeling, unconsciously renewing it and keeping it hot. 10. Renunciation is considered harmful in the practical world because worldly success requires ambition, effort, and responsibility. While one should be effortless regarding internal psychological feelings, one must remain a doer with goals and plans to navigate external physical reality. Part 3. Essay Questions Instructions. Use the themes from the text to develop comprehensive responses to the following prompts. 1. The paradox of effort. Discuss the author's claim that enlightenment is simple and happens within a split second, yet many seekers struggle for decades. Focus on the transition from doing to understanding. 2. The nature of the mind as pravagam. Analyze the concept of the mind as a flowing river. How does the cessation of willful interference transform the waking state into a dreamlike state of liberation? 3. Comparative paths to liberation. Evaluate the different methods mentioned in the text, including the path of devotion, surrender, e.g., Nisargadatta Maharaj and Theni Swami, versus the path of logical understanding. Why does the author prefer the latter for scholars? 4. The role of failure in enlightenment. Using the examples of Buddha, Ramana Maharishi, and J. Krishnamurti, examine how the abandonment of all efforts and the recognition of inability serve as catalysts for spiritual realization. 5. Misinterpreting spiritual terminology. Explore how words like anantham, infinite versus bliss, and upavasam, fasting, lead seekers toward imaginary goals. How does the author correct these misconceptions to bring the seeker back to actuality? Part 4. Glossary of key terms, term definition. Atman, the soul or spirit, the self-luminous, eternal seer that serves as the real subject of a human being. Atma Sachathkar, self-realization, the direct understanding or vision of the Atman, often described as the disappearance of ignorance. Brahman, the totality of God, or the absolute reality, the source of light that illuminates the mind. Chittabhasan, Abhasan, reflected consciousness, the limited intelligence, ignorance of the mind that results from the light of Brahman touching the psychological structure. Durya, the fourth state of consciousness, a state of awakening where the waking world is perceived with the same unreality as a dream. Kudastha, the witness or the limited portion of Brahman that touches the mind, another term for the Atman as the unchanging observer. Manolaya, a state where the mind is fixed or joined with a specific thought or sensation, the cause of all psychological experiences. Manonasa, the destruction of the mind's tendency to fixate, ending of manolaya, the natural, liquid state of a liberated mind. Nirvana, a mindless or extinguished state, the dimension of functioning without motive or the doer entity. Praman, an authentic or absolute truth, specifically as stated in sacred spiritual scriptures. Pravagam, an endless natural flow, describes the mind of an enlightened person which moves spontaneously without stagnant knots of effort. Satchitanantham, a Sanskrit term often translated as truth consciousness bliss, though the text clarifies anantham refers to the infinite, rather than a pleasurable sensation. Sankalpa, a mental determination or intention. The author notes that using sankalpa to become a witness is merely a mental process that confirms duality. Upavasam, literally meaning fasting, used in a folk story within the text to illustrate how seekers misinterpret the refusal of food, lack of ego gratification, as a delicious food, blissful experience.